I've just muted myself. Can you hear me okay? Hi, Dolph. Thank you for joining us.
Sorry, I'm in my car, and also
Oh,
that.
no problem. So I know that you're on a tight schedule, so I think we'll start. Just to say why I'm doing this. So every year I rush over to shore, usually about midnight, and suddenly remember to leave the lights on for Kristallnacht, and usually post something on social media. And last year I thought, um, particularly given the goings on in the country generally, that actually there's a lot more to it than just leaving the lights on, and it's really an opportunity to reflect. And I thought of you a couple of years ago. I had the privilege of speaking with you at the time your great grandma Lily was unwell, but she was still with us. And we did a Holocaust Memorial Day event together, and it's fascinating to hear about, I guess, your and Lily's journey to social media fame, which I think came about because of COVID. Um, so maybe we could start by just asking you to share a little bit about her life's work and the social media journey and how that continues. And then we'll
I see.
talk about contemporary events.
I see.
And of course, I read your article, was it in the JC? Which was exactly what I was thinking we would discuss tonight about the lessons of Kristallnacht and have we learned them at all.
Yeah.
Just say I think particularly the fact that Kristallnacht marks the beginning of obviously a terrible time in history, and we know that we often mark beginnings. We have the beginning of the destruction of the temple and the siege of Jerusalem. So I think it's often underrated, as it were. That's the right word. So sorry, over to you. A bit about you and Lily and your life's work.
100% agreed. I think the article you read was in the Sunday Times
Sunday Times,
this
sorry.
morning.
Good.
But I did also write one for the Jewish Chronicles, so it could be either. Uh,
Right.
I will start by saying my great grandmother was born in Hungary, so she was not a survivor of Kristallnacht. But nonetheless, because of the work that I've done, and I will go on to explain that with her over the past few years, and did with her rather, um, I speak on all occasions, and as you say, Kristallnacht is often regarded by many Holocaust historians and many across the world as the start of the long, twisted road to the Holocaust. And of course, it is a twisted road and it's convoluted, and there are many steps in the Holocaust that one can coin as the beginning of the end, as the beginning of the final solution, the beginning of the Holocaust itself, the beginning of mass destruction, the beginning of the othering of the Jews. But Kristallnacht, I think, is one clear marker. And again, it's never easy to find that marker. But Kristallnacht obviously is that one clear marker for the world and for the Jewish community as to where that all starts. My great grandmother was born in Hungary in 1923. She was born in southern Hungary into a normal, large, Orthodox Hungarian family. One family that had lived there in that community in southern Hungary for over 600 years. She often described herself and her family as more Hungarian than the Hungarians. And I recently went back to where she lived, and I went to the grave site, and I saw again graves which proved that her family were there for hundreds of years. My great grandmother describes her childhood, or described her childhood, as an idyllic one similar to the one that I grew up in here in Golders Green in London, where there were many Jews around. Jewish primary school that she went to, two Jewish schools, one which was Neolog, one which was Orthodox, and she was the eldest of six children, and she really was a second mother to those six children. And she lived a normal life, really, up until 1944. Of course, there were laws against the Jewish population in Hungary, but again, lived a very normal, ordinary Jewish life, at least ordinary for what it was like in Eastern Europe at the time. And the anti-Jewish laws didn't really affect her. She wasn't of university age, so the law that Jews in Hungary couldn't go to university didn't affect her. And again, lived a life where she was very shielded from her parents, didn't understand about the anti-Semitism that was going and growing across Europe and Eastern Europe until 1944, March 1944, when the Nazis invaded Hungary. And almost overnight, everything changed. Their neighbors, who they only the day before had got on with and were playing with and knew very well, turned on them, knocked on their doors, asked for their valuable belongings. Then the Hungarian Red Cross, the Hungarian kind of Red Cross police force came in, gave them yellow stars, which they had to sew onto their clothing. Then there was a curfew imposed, and then eventually they had to move into ghettos, into the poorest part of the town, with the Jews from the surrounding areas where they were for a few weeks before, in July 1940, transport. And this all happened very quickly, of course, within 2 months, being taken on transport to a place that they didn't know, which ended up being Auschwitz-Birkenau. My great grandmother's father passed away in 1942, so he wasn't alive, but my great grandmother's mother, her youngest brother, three of her sisters were all rounded up onto a train. Her eldest brother was taken onto another train. He was taken to slave labor. But the five of them and their mother were taken to Auschwitz-Birkenau. 5 long days in the grueling heat of the summer in July 1944. And they didn't know where they were going until my great-grandmother remembers arriving, the train slowing down, and she looked out on the peaks of the kind of the cracks of the train tracks of the train, and she saw standing at the train tracks were kind of musclemen, people that. Oh, have you lost me?
We lost you, but you're back.
Oh, very good. But look, she saw human skeletons walking, and she didn't really understand where she had arrived to, and then the she was much older than that. She was actually 20, but looked young. And another one of those men told her, split up from your sister. You look like twins, split up from your sister. And so she split up. She never got to say goodbye to her mother, her younger sister, or her youngest brother. But with two of her sisters, they split up into different groups of 5. And they were confronted by Dr. Mengele, who sent them to the right, and my great grandmother's mother, younger sister, and brother to the left, never to be seen again, and to be gassed within 3 hours of arrival in Auschwitz-Birkenau, along with 14,000 other people that day on the 9th of July, 1944. My great grandmother spent 4 months in Auschwitz, where she was sewing for the Nazis, amongst a few other jobs, but the majority of the time she was sewing for the Nazis. And she was given a number, A10572, a permanent reminder of the Nazis' crimes against humanity, which she always read out in every single speech. And she always used to say, of course, as we know, that that was the end of Lily Ebert as we knew it in her first life. She used to say, I had 3 lives, my life before the Holocaust, my life during the Holocaust, and my life after. And she used to say, and that was the moment when they inscribed that number on my arm, that the first life of Lily Ebert was shattered and was finished. That moment when they gave her that number, and that would last for her for the rest of her life as a permanent reminder. And she would always show it proudly after as a symbol of survival, that she is now here and they aren't. And even though they inscribed that number on her, and even though it would stay with her, she was able to live again as Lily Ebert and build a huge, large, and loving family, which we'll get onto. After 4 months in Auschwitz, together with her 2 sisters, who both managed to survive the 4 months, they were taken to Germany, to a slave labor factory where they were making bullets for the Nazis. And there's often the phrase, especially after the Holocaust, that the Jews didn't resist. They were like lambs to the slaughter. And my great grandmother would always say in every speech that she gave that that wasn't true. For her, she had her own personal resistance. Not only throughout Auschwitz was she able to hide the only piece of jewelry which went through Auschwitz with its original owner, a pendant with which my great grandmother managed to smuggle away from the Nazis. And that stayed with her throughout the whole of the war and after, and she wore that every single day. But also when she was making bullets for the Nazis, she used to put the good bullets in the bad pile and the bad bullets in the good pile. And of course, that could have led to her death, but they never really found out. And she carried on doing that for the 5 months that she was a slave laborer. And then in April 1945, she was taken on a death march. 5 days, no food, no water. Her shoes had already worn out by then. And it was still cold in April. For some reason, she used to say it was freezing, even though, of course, the weather in Europe in April usually is not freezing, but she used to describe it as freezing cold, walking for 5 days. And suddenly they saw the Nazis running away, disappearing, and they couldn't understand what was happening. And they saw planes flying low ahead and tanks. They could hear the sound of tanks rolling in. And a group of Jewish, as it happens, American soldiers stumbled across 500 emaciated, young Jewish survivors who had been taken on this death march towards a forest in Germany to be killed. And just within probably a day or two, she used to say, before they got to this forest, the American Jewish soldiers found them. And this group was led by Chaplain Schachter, who was a famous chaplain in the US Army. And they took the first steps in trying to rehabilitate my great grandmother and those 500 other girls. They transported them to Buchenwald concentration camp, which had been kind of transferred into a housing place for many survivors. And there she had her first Shabbat after the war. And there she also received a banknote by the soldier who had liberated her. A piece of kindness. This soldier wanted to kind of give her something that he would remember, that she would remember him. And he looked for a piece of paper, he couldn't find one. So he pulled out a German banknote, like a £5 note. And he wrote on it 10 words. He wrote 10 words of hope, the start to a new life, good luck and happiness. And he didn't write his name, but he wrote his position in the army, chief assistant to Chaplain Schachter. And 76 years later, during COVID, my great grandmother moved in with us and she brought her belongings with her. And she moved in with us because she was lonely and because it was the only time in her life that she never had her family around her after the Holocaust. And so she came to us with this big box of belongings. And I remember she started showing me things. She said, she was so sad that she couldn't go out to schools and to shuls and to universities and to workplaces to share her story, that she wanted me to start posting these artifacts that she brought with her online. And she showed me for the first time that she had ever shown anyone since she put this banknote away after the war. She showed me this banknote this American liberator had given to her. And the second she showed it to me, I remember joking with her that perhaps within 24 hours I'll be able to find this soldier on Twitter. I said to her, I'll tweet this banknote out and we'll try and track him down using his position in the army and maybe we'll find him. And really, I thought it was a joke. I didn't really believe that that could happen. But I remember I clicked the blue button which says tweet. Within 2 hours, 8 million people had seen the tweet. And it turned into an international mystery hunt for this soldier. And we managed to find him within 24 hours. And this made news headlines around the world. And it really, for me, was the first time in my life that I realized the power of social media and the power that I have using my phone to reach millions of people with her Holocaust testimony during COVID. And I guess they say the rest is history. And since then, we started a TikTok channel where we would kind of operate an Ask Me Anything kind of feature where people would comment questions and we would reply with videos. And I think people were so attracted to my great grandmother's story because they saw not only the darker side of human history, the Holocaust, but also they saw how people can overcome darkness, how people can overcome the worst evil, the darkest depths of human history, and come out of it and rebuild from the ashes. And my great grandmother did rebuild. She was in Israel in 1948 when the state of Israel was declared on the streets of Tel Aviv. She remembers partying there. She helped set up Tel Aviv and Bnei Barak. And then she moved to England and she set up and built a huge, large and loving family of 10 grandchildren, 38 great grandchildren. In her last year, a great grandchild, 5 strong Jewish generations. And so we managed kind of to capture hearts and minds of tens of millions of people around the world, 2 million followers on TikTok, over 1 billion views on TikTok and Twitter. Over 500,000 people read my great grandmother's memoir, which was published again in the last few years of her life. And that's like a quick overview of her story. Sorry, I'm rushing, but obviously time is limited. So I think if you have any questions or specifically about social media or anything else, we can go from there.
I think it's incredibly moving. I highly recommend reading the book Lily's Promise. Anyone who hasn't, it's extremely moving story of hope and faith. And it almost seems a shame to ask, but I will ask because obviously we're here marking Kristallnacht. I suppose I'll put it to you like this: if you ever wondered whether it was time to sort of close down the social media, I don't know if this was a thought even after her passing. Of course, everything is beshert, and as a result of the social media, her legacy is preserved and the influence is preserved, and you've continued that very much full time. But I do remember last time we spoke, I was absolutely gobsmacked at the amount of abusive comments and messages. I don't even want to repeat them. It's the worst thing you can imagine to say to a then 90-something-year-old, 100-year-old lady who survived the Holocaust. Things like Hitler was right. And if there was ever any kind of proof that sadly this education and this role is still needed, it's the dark underbelly of the internet. Can I just ask you a bit about that? Because obviously you have to deal with that on a daily basis.
Right. I think it's a very good point, and it's one which I get asked a lot, understandably. Firstly, my answer is no. The greatest revenge, my great grandmother used to say, against the Nazis was not only that she built a large and loving family and not only that she went back to Auschwitz 6 times with her grandchildren and walked out of the gates freely as a free Jewish woman, as a proud Jewish woman with her grandchildren in hand, but also that she was able to educate and that she was able to tell the world what happened because of the Nazis and that she was there and they weren't. And I want to continue in that message. And likewise, the greatest attack, not even attack, but the greatest way to show the anti-Semites that they haven't won and that we Jews are thriving and will continue to live and will continue to educate no matter what they say is to continue and to educate. And actually the anti-Semites only show the needs why I need to continue because there's so many people who don't know. And also my job I see as an educator, if you want to call me that on social media, is never to actually counter the anti-Semites and to try and change their hearts and minds, but is actually to reach the young people. Even as young as 5 years old, I see these people commenting on my channels.
Wow.
Who may well be influenced by these Holocaust deniers, Holocaust distorters, anti-Semites on social media. We need to make sure that the truth reaches them before all of that disgusting content does. And so the only way to do that is to have Jews, is to have Holocaust educators, is to have survivors, eyewitnesses on these platforms sharing their stories. And also, I would say that yes, we get, or now I get, over 5,000 anti-Semitic comments every month, and terrible DMs and death threats. But I also get tremendous amounts of love from all over the world, including in countries where they're not allowed to talk about the Holocaust. Last week, I gave a Zoom call and my presentation, which I usually give on the Holocaust, which is like an hour long, to a school in Pakistan, an underground kind of school, which is illegal. But we did a Zoom call with them and there was a translator and I gave them a whole lecture on the Holocaust. And these are people who aren't allowed to learn about the Holocaust. So I think whilst everything in life has good and bad, and everything in life can be used for evil and for good, because ultimately evil and bad is a choice. And we often refer to people like Dr. Mengele as the angel of death and out of earth being, or monsters, the Nazis, but they were humans. They were some of the most educated and civilized people in the world, the Nazis, and they chose evil. And it's the same thing with anything. Social media can be used for the worst evil, and it's led to terrible atrocities across the world, and including things like the Manchester terror attack. I mean, you wonder where these people get indoctrinated. Not only is it in their mosques and through hate preachers, but it's also through social media. And there's many studies on that. But ultimately, it can also be used for tremendous good. And there's so much that people across the world have reached out to me to say that they've learned from my great grandmother, from her story. In fact, there were people who contemplated doing terrible things to themselves. I remember who used to write letters to my great grandmother saying that her light and her kind of ability to show that even throughout the darkest depths in your life, you will overcome it and there's light at the end of the tunnel, that helped them get through their dark times in their life. So again, there's both sides of the coin, but I take the view that you need to continue to educate and there needs to be Jews on these platforms.
Thank you. And before we come to the present day, I mean, I was at Remembrance Day event today, and it was very striking to me that there were fewer and fewer veterans there. And obviously, sadly, Lily is no longer with us, and many of her generation are no longer with us. And obviously, the first person testimony is going to be harder and harder to come by. And at the same time, the denial is increasing. And obviously, that's part of your mission in life. But perhaps your thoughts on that in terms of how things are going to change as we get further and further from the events.
Yeah. Well, look, these are the last moments. And I know we've been saying that for almost 10 years, perhaps even longer. But these really are. I mean, only this week we lost Manfred Goldberg, one of the greats of Holocaust education and of the Holocaust community in the UK, who I and my great grandmother knew very well. And so, look, there will be fewer and fewer survivors, and we're moving further on from the time. So it becomes harder for younger people and for people across the world to relate to these events and to understand kind of how to put the lessons of the past into our lives today. But ultimately, we all know that we can't allow history to repeat itself, and the only way to do that is through education, is to continue. Right. And nothing will ever be the same or even come close to the power and the impact that survivor testimony can have. But there are videos, there are Testimony 360, which Holocaust Educational Trust did, which is a VR where you can ask the Holocaust survivor any question. There's the holograms, which the USC Shoah Foundation did in America, which again is a similar concept where you can sit in a room with a kind of virtual Holocaust survivor and they've asked him 6,000 questions. So anything you can think of, he will have an answer to, or she. So look, these things will never come anywhere close, but ultimately there are ways and there are organizations and trusts which are experimenting with new technology. And again, that comes back to the previous question that like we can either say technology is terrible, we shouldn't use it, or we can say how can we use it for the good? And there are people using it for incredible amounts of good. Ultimately, though, the truth is this, that the messages of the survivors need to come number one and center in Holocaust education and their stories. And that is the way to capture the minds and kind of and hearts of young people. Because I've sat in a lecture hall not too recently. I'm only 21 years old, so I know exactly how it feels to have to listen to a 2-3 hour lecture about the Holocaust and kind of have it in this complete abstract format. And Stalin said it best. He said, 1 million deaths is a statistic, one death is a tragedy. And of course we don't want to quote Stalin, but that's the truth. That's the truth. Right. When you hear one person's story, when you understand one person's story, when you go to Auschwitz in Block 7 and you see the shoes and you think, well, those could be my shoes, that's how you put it into perspective. And so I think we need to continue with the traditional form, which is survivor testimony.
I always tell people the story. I went on the March of Living more years ago than I care to remember, probably at least 30 years ago. And it was a group from Carmel College and JFS, and we were a bunch of Jewish teenagers. And people were not as perhaps reverent as they could have been until we got, I think it's Majdanek, isn't it, where there's the case with the suitcases and the glass in the shoes. And when people saw the suitcases and they saw names, Shapiro, Goldberg, Cohen, and these were their family names, they broke down because it made it personal for people. Let's talk about the present day. It's a big elephant in the room. We spent a very enjoyable Shabbat with Chaz and Johnny Turgle, who, of course, his grandma Gina and his other grandparents were survivors, and we were discussing that it's very trite to say it's not 1939. You know, the streets of Britain. It's not 1939. It's not Kristallnacht, and we shouldn't. We don't want to panic everybody. And you know, I guess it's always this question of finding a balance between our concerns and not over exaggerating. On the other hand, the last few years have been very frightening. Obviously, sadly, Lily is not with us anymore, but she would have been with us in 2019 when Jeremy Corbyn was elected, which I think was a seminal turning point for many in the Jewish community. I'm sure she would have seen her fair share of contemporary anti-Semitism, including, of course, the comments on the social media. So I suppose through the lens of what your thoughts on sort of how do we find the balance between the very real need to really sort of sound a wake-up call, particularly to government, but not to overstate the problem either. You know, as we said, it's not 1939, but these are definitely trying times. I suppose also just if you've got any thoughts on, you know, there are people who have legitimate criticisms of the Israeli government, but I struggle to believe that most of the people on the streets that we're seeing are those people. So how you deal with that kind of nuance as well.
Yeah, look, I'll take it in the reverse order. I think, firstly, after the ceasefire, the people that are left on these protests are ultimately the extremists. The moderates have kind of fallen away, and the people now protesting are genuinely people who hate Jews, who hate our only homeland, and who kind of see Israel and the Jewish homeland to have no right to exist and are actually anti-Semites, and there's no smokescreen to it. There's no reason why they should still be protesting today. They're not protesting about what's going on in Western Sahara or in Nigeria with the Christians or even in Syria or anywhere else. So there's no doubt in my mind about that. And ultimately, I've done tests even during the war when there were people who may well have been concerned about Gaza, but you asked them where Gaza is on a map. And I did this because I went to protests and I made videos and they went very viral, and they could not even tell you what river or what sea they're chanting about or where Israel or Gaza is even on a map. So they're people who have no idea what they're talking about. They're people who've been completely ideologically captured by social media and by university campuses, etc. And that's a whole wider conversation. But I think now what we're seeing on the streets and the problem ultimately with the current protests and also in university is that we're left with just the extremists, not the moderates anymore, because the moderates have peeled away. And so ultimately, I think the anti-Semitism, especially on university campuses, is only going to get worse in the next few weeks and months rather than better. That's the first point. Back to the second thing, I think it's easy, as you say, to ultimately quickly revert to say this is the Holocaust, this is 1930s, this is Kristallnacht. It's not. It's definitely not. And actually, we're doing ourselves a disservice because when we start to coin things which they're not, I think non-Jews and the silent majority start to say this is getting ridiculous and start to kind of say, like, just have some perspective here. And it's bad. There's no covering up that what's going on in the UK, the changing demographics, the changing political leadership, the fact that many political leaders feel that they need to take a certain stance over Israel, but also over anti-Semitism in the UK because of their voting kind of majorities and blocks. The fact that they are changing their views for that is dangerous and it's bad, and we shouldn't be complacent. And also the level of anti-Semitism, and to think that something like Manchester isn't going to happen again, I think is just ridiculous. I think we all know that something could easily happen, and the same as Manchester, it won't be a question of if, it will be a question of when, because that's the direction of travel in Europe and the West across the whole world. But it's not the 1930s, and the Holocaust needs to remain sacrosanct and unique in human history because it was, in the scale, in the size, and in the systematic nature, and also in the state-sponsored nature of it. We don't have a government now. Yes, the government is not as supportive as a Conservative government, and they could be doing a lot more. And there's lots of criticisms, and believe me, I'm the first person, and I have meetings with them, and I'm always criticizing them on social media, and that's fine. But we don't have a government that's going to state-sponsor and cram us into ovens. And there's not going to be gas chambers again on Europe continent, on kind of in Europe, or not even on the continent, but also in Britain in the near future. Certainly, though, it's bad, and many Jews are considering leaving, and we can all see why.
Was there any
my response, just very quickly, would be it's easy to complain in life, and we should complain, and we should make sure our voices are heard. But what actually are you going to do about it? Because I hear the whole time, especially young people, and it actually frustrates me, saying, oh, we're going to leave, or this is terrible, this is 1930s. And I turn around to them and I say, you've got an Instagram page, you've got a Twitter page, you've got a voice, your own university. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to start speaking up? Because if not, then our position in this country will get weaker, and maybe we will have to leave. But ultimately, if people do stand up, if people do speak up, then we can actually start kind of encouraging others to as well. And you can't keep saying, and this also is what I think the Jews and we all need to realize is that we can't keep saying where are the silent majority if we're not speaking up ourselves. If we're not speaking up ourselves, that's the truth.
Where it's a difficult question, but if Lily was with us right now, how would she react, or how did she react in her lifetime to these kind of spikes of anti-Semitism and extremism in our
She
own
was
country?
firstly extremely worried. I mean, she only passed away last October, so
Yeah,
she was well aware of the reaction to October 7th in our
yeah.
country, the protests. And again, we did interviews about this and published our responses. She was very worried about the direction of travel because, again, she saw echoes of the past. She didn't see the past repeating itself in the same way, but she saw echoes of the past in the caricatures, in the othering of the Jews again, in the pushing of Jews to the margins, and the normalization, complete normalization of anti-Semitism in our society today. And I think that point is the most worrying. It's just how normal anti-Semitism has become. And that's not just since October 7th. That's actually since Jeremy Corbyn. What Jeremy Corbyn did was allow anti-Semitism to jump straight back into the mainstream in society in Britain. And I fear that's also what Mandami is going to do in New York, even more than it's already been done. And that's what's so dangerous because it just allows the othering of the Jew and just normalization of whatever you want to say about Jews, even if it goes criminalized, which so often it doesn't. It allows it to go completely unchecked and unchallenged, and that's when we start to reach very dangerous levels.
Well, also, even if you criminalize it, it simply drives it underground. It doesn't change that
Exactly,
person. If
exactly.
somebody gets imprisoned for 6 months for anti-Semitism, they're not going to like Jews after that.
Totally.
I'm conscious of time. You've got about 5 minutes, and if anyone has any questions, please do post on the chat. And then after that, we're going to hear from Zach Jeffay as well. So I'll just give people a moment to post questions. Just while they're doing that, I mean, we start off by talking about leaving the lights on. It just strikes me one of the messages from your great grandma's life and the life of so many who educated and so many survivors is one of hope and one of light. So perhaps leaving the lights on isn't just to say we're still here, but it's also to say that ultimately the light will triumph over the darkness. And
Totally.
one thing that always amazes me, and I saw, you know, certainly videos and I've read the book, and just the dignity that so many like Lily had. You know, they could have been bitter, they could have been, you know, vindictive, they could have quite understandably wanted revenge, and they didn't. They turned it into a positive to just educate people about, you know, having a better tomorrow. And I think, you know, it's mind blowing, you know, to go through that trauma and not emerge bitter, or, you know, to have more faith rather than less faith, I think is a fantastic thing. And I can only just say, you know, we salute that, and it's a great privilege to be discussing her and the legacy that you've continued. And I guess that's a testament to her faith and her strength.
No, I completely agree. I think, and it goes back to the point I was saying, which is like people often ask, why do you have so much success, in inverted commas, on social media and just in general with your great grandmother? And I think it's that point that people saw that light really does triumph over darkness. And so many people, especially when we started during COVID, they needed that message. They needed that hope and that light, and to see that there is always light at the end of the darkest tunnels. And my great grandmother and all the survivors provided that. And also with faith, I mean, people used to say, how do you believe in God, to my great grandmother after the Holocaust? And also Manfred Goldberg, perfect examples of this. They used to say, and again, back to, it's the same with hatred. Why don't you hate? Why aren't you bitter? And my great grandmother always used to say to people, firstly, humans did this. And it goes back to what I said earlier, that humans chose to be evil. They chose to implement what they did. And my great grandmother used to say, I can never know why God did this to me and to my family, but I would rather have questions and go up after 120 and ask them than have the answers and not be here anymore and not be able to raise this family. But more importantly, she used to say to people, why don't I hate? It's because hate only breeds hate. And I've seen that at its highest level. But love and kindness and tolerance breeds more of that. And that's what she always used to say to people. And it's so true. And I think that's the message, especially to non-Jews, which I tried to share, which is just that we need a bit more of that tolerance, and that no matter what color, ethnicity, race, religion we are, no matter what God we believe in, or even what country we live in and what country we believe in too, when you cut us, it hurts, and we all bleed the same color, and that color is red. And there's so much more in common than that which divides us between the whole world. And so we just need to find that commonality.
Dov, thank you so much. Thank you for your time. And I know you've got a family event, so a family reunion, in fact. So please enjoy. And thank you, really, thank you so much for joining us. And
Thank you.
Lily's Promise is on Amazon, well worth buying and reading. And your social media, handle is?
On TikTok at Lilia, but until Forman, and everywhere else you can find it until Forman.
Right.
And if anyone has any questions, feel free to on my social media channels or on the internet. You can find my email or DM me. And apologies, I have to run off, and also that was a bit rushed. I'm in the car.
Thank you for your time.
But
Appreciate it. Thank you so much and for everything that you're doing. Thank you, Dov. We have Zach with us, hopefully. Zach, are you with us?
Yeah,
See you on.
lovely
Hi,
to see
Zach.
you.
So Zach had exactly, I think, about 3 hours notice. Thank you so much for joining us. I think a lot of you probably do know Zach. Zach, he can introduce himself, but Zach Jeffay lives in Modern. He's originally from Manchester, yes, from up north now. And Zach is an educator for J Roots, and we've had the privilege in our community. Sadly, since Sally and Phil went to Israel, we don't see you as much. But over many years, we had the privilege of hearing from you on Tisha B'av and other occasions. You regularly take groups to Poland and to the camps. And I have to say, one thing that always stands out, and I'm sure we'll be hearing from you in a moment along these lines, is that what could be a very depressing and miserable and sort of generally very negative kind of experience of going around death camps, you always manage to turn it into a positive educational experience and one that speaks about positive Jewish identity, and that's why it's very special to be talking to you. I know also you've written a blog about why Kristallnacht doesn't get enough, can't remember the title, but enough column inches or something along those lines. So it's very fitting that we're speaking to you tonight. So I'm going to hand over to you, Zach, and hopefully you, a co-host, you can share your screen as well.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for the opportunity. It's always nice to unite Modian and South Woodford and Wanstead, obviously, all together. So just the opportunity to do something around this evening, as you said, turning the lights on in Shul. So if I'm going to try and share screen and see if this works, tell me if you can see it. Is it working?
I can see it. Hopefully everyone can.
Okay, everyone else can. Okay, fantastic. So what I thought we would do, and I think it actually takes me back to, it was Tisha B'Av, probably maybe even 10 years ago, we did something together in the shul, which was talking about it almost touches a little bit what Dov was talking, the uniqueness of the Holocaust, whether in fact it is unique or to what extent it's part of a much larger story, and repeating patterns that we see. And I know that certainly towards the sort of the latter part of the conversation, this idea of like patterns that come back in Jewish history today in particular. So I thought we'd try and do is look at some of the themes, events really of sort of Germany before the war, not dealing with the Holocaust from 1939 onwards, but sort of I would say like the early years, and then try and sort of pick out some ideas. And I think Rabbi Wallenberg wanted some questions as we go. So really, I think the first point is what we call today, what we call tonight. And I think Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, is sort of etched into the memories in terms of the marketing of the event, but in terms of being conscious that even the marketing of the event was itself a Nazi invention, in the same way that the events of that night, of those 2 days, was a Nazi creation. They also came up with the branding, the sort of the newspaper headlines, and Kristallnacht, this German term, was what the Germans called it. And I think that, as with anything, whenever there's sort of perpetrator and victim, the person crafting the narrative is trying to say something. And there's almost like an elegance about Kristallnacht, that this shattered glass, which makes that into the big thing, when in fact sort of a much more suitable term for it, and I would say like the much more Jewish term, is the November pogrom. It was nothing more than a pogrom that sort of puts it into the true tradition of pogroms that unfortunately many of our European, if we're of European descent, sort of great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents were very familiar with. And this was on a state-sponsored scale, which sort of dwarfed the things that most people had been familiar with. And when you talk about Kristallnacht and the broken glass being the essential part, there's the sort of the question in the back of everybody's head, which is, okay, so some broken windows. Well, riots have broken windows, football hooligans have broken windows. The fact that more than 10,000 Jews were carted off to concentration camps, that 1,400 synagogues were burned, and this is really the other part of the story, which is a part of massive sort of scholarly debate. There's a number thrown around of like 100 and something people being murdered on the night. Scholars are now putting the number well into the thousands in terms of people who were murdered, which puts it on a level which I think that sometimes when we talk about sort of simply Kristallnacht, we're not really we're not really bearing in mind. So just a few sort of really like selected things to deal with as we go. If we can, 1 second. Okay, just a little bit of a thought about where German Jews were in the really the rise of Nazism as these winds of change are coming into Germany. And one of the really interesting organizations and the identities of German Jews is German Jews as war veterans, which I think is particularly sort of topical for now. And the number that was hidden, you can see thrown around sort of here, 12,000 Jews who had fallen in the struggle for the fatherland, talking about the First World War, that the contribution of German Jews was like a proud part of their identity. So much so that when you fast forward here to this day, not long into the Nazi government of Germany, you see Richard Stern, who is sort of this 1st of April, which was a Shabbat in 1933, which was the boycott of Jewish shops, where they stationed Nazis outside outside Jewish shops, insisting that nobody buy from them. His response is to sort of put on his, I'm sure he always dressed like that, like a fine German gentleman, but he puts on his cross, he puts on his German medal, that no, it seems to be some sort of a mistake here, that you can't be sort of putting me outside of the space of German society. I am German society. Sort of, we're so integrated. And again, it comes back to all of these questions that were being asked at the beginning of the 1900s, which is how do Jews protect themselves in a changing world? Do you sort of put on the cloak of Jewishness more, or do you cast off the cloak of Jewishness more and put on the cloak of your nation state or your sort of homeland? And here, very much, I think, and this is going to add, and we'll see over the next few pictures, some of the struggles. Forget about the struggles of sort of life, but really the mental struggles that as a community German Jews are going through in those early years. And then you see sort of other aspects, which again, if I'm trying to draw out patterns, and I'll sometimes leave the interpretation to you, but the concept of humiliation is going to be a large part of moving Jews out of society, sort of moving them from the center of really engaged in what German society is. A lawyer who's being made to walk through the streets with this sign on. It's going to be a pattern that we're going to see time and time again. All of this is going to be a precursor to the things that we associate as what we'll call it the November pogrom, in brackets, what we sort of often call Kristallnacht. And it's not none of what we see, none of what we're familiar with is really by chance. Most of it is there's a lot of structure, there's a lot of thought here, and even when you see the photograph behind the photograph, you see that the person trying to get the perfect angle of the Jew standing outside the shop with the sign on it. So you've got all of these elements. You've got and I think sort of again, if we're talking of patterns, this is 1933 social media. If you can get the best photograph of the Jew sort of calling for the boycott outside of their own shop. And that's really one aspect of it. And I think that the idea of state-sponsored terrorism, state-sponsored anti-Semitism is itself a scary thought. But there's something in this picture which really, I think, is almost more terrifying. And that's the homemade anti-Semitism. That's the Boy Scouts, the Hitler Youth, and not even the sort of not even necessarily the ideological sort of vanguard of Nazism. Those people who are going around making their own signs. Okay, that on the way into the campsite, we're going to put up a sign here on the tree saying "No Jews welcome," and on at the swimming pool there's going to be all of these things which are not mandated from the top, but reflect a society which really has either taken the invitation to sort of go that it's open season on Jews, or has really inherited and sort of soaked up what's coming from their from the cultural norms which are being created. Again, patterns that we may or may not be familiar with. And then what I want to just like flip is because so much of the time that we talk about the Holocaust and Nazi Germany, we're talking about Jews as people who things happened to them. And I think that's one of the mistakes, because in the telling of the story, we create a Jewish passivity, which ultimately, when we get much further in the story, people ask all sorts of questions, which I think have a basis, but really have much more complex answers than the questions themselves about like, why Jews didn't do things, why Jews didn't fight back, in a sort of very simplistic sense. And I think really, if you delve back into the early years, you see that Jews were always people who insisted on having agency, insisted on doing something, and sometimes it was more successful and sometimes it was less successful. But a few just examples of this. One was this Jewish committee which was founded in Germany very, very early on, which was a community which had been very disparate. The community of Berlin and the community of Munich and the community of here, there, and everywhere didn't have this unified sense. They didn't have the board of deputies or the Jewish Leadership Council or whoever it might be. And Rabbi Dr. Leo Beck, who became the sort of sitting at the head, this was one of the first attempts at sort of uniting the Jewish community, again, with all of its fractures and all of its differences, which Jewish communities have always known, and we know very well today. But this attempt that when the external forces are squashing us in, then maybe it's the time to start to think together. Now, they're not particularly well known in the history of this period of time, because they didn't really succeed in the greatest sense. Ultimately, they sort of get subsumed into sort of being a Reich representative of the Jews, and according to some people, even sort of the precursors of these like Jewish councils, the Judenrat, who are sort of acting under this sort of very, very clear pressure of the German government, of the Nazis themselves. But this idea that this was Jewish responses are sort of there, and that's in the face of these things that we're familiar with, the burning of the books, the sort of the clash of ideas. And the burning of the books and I think it's probably something that many of us are familiar with, is taking place not just in the streets, but university campuses. And let's just throw in there sort of patterns that we're familiar with, which is that sometimes our most educated youth or young people or postgraduates, undergraduates, are sort of most fiercely against the sort of the space given to various different ideas. And now if we come back to this idea of Jewish responses, so one of the Jewish responses, and I can say that I'm an advocate of this, which is the question of a Jewish homeland, that already then in the 1930s was not something which was a conversation purely and simply because of anti-Semitism. Okay, although Herzl had been motivated to his Zionism by this sense of where Jews fit into society, but it was also a yearning. The first Jews to have been making Aliyah already or there'd been a constant Jewish presence, but really the late 1800s, and there'd been an established Jewish community there before that. Jews were saying that there's a place in the world which is ours, and yes, at a certain point in time, it dovetails with our political needs and our social needs and our security needs, that this should be a place that when you have to go there, there needs to be a place in the world that has to let you in. And you see it again, a variety of these pictures that come from 1930s Germany, the youth at Aliyah singing, teaching this idea that there's a different path, there's a different future that might not be a father and mother in 1930s Germany imagining that their grandchildren are going to be going to school in Berlin come the 1980s. They weren't to know what was going to be the cause necessarily of such a change in sort of social structure and family dynamic. And here you see sort of what could be a controversial photograph in today's world. The Jews of standing outside the Palestine office here in Berlin, waiting. The restrictions were great. What you had to go through in order to get the correct visas, the amount of money that you would need in terms of a guarantee. All of these things are going to play into the decisions that people make or the decisions that people don't make. And again, the simplistic question, which is, well, why didn't German Jews sort of pack up their bags and sort of be on their way? Anyone who lives anywhere today knows that sort of getting up and leaving from one place to another place is something that comes with many layers of decisions before it's something that you do. And if you stand to lose any economic status that you have up until that point, the decision is even more difficult, which I think makes it even more exceptional of the people who did do it, who left sort of Central Europe to come and live in the Middle Eastern climate, not knowing exactly what was they were waiting for. And I think that this photo, to a certain extent, sort of really characterizes some of those aspects of German Jewry. Sort of gentlemen in their sort of finery with their hats, sort of waiting, sort of, because even if you were to make all of the decisions that you wanted to decide, the amount of things that were outside your choice. Again, on the one hand, the people are insistent on making choices themselves, but nevertheless, the things that if you don't have the piece of paper, you don't have the piece of paper. If you don't have the sort of approval from the right person, it's just not a possibility. Even if everything else in an ideal world would be sort of 1935, I'm looking for somewhere to go. And just to shift with a couple more examples. One of the phenomena that happens amongst German Jewry come 1933 is this turning inwards, as they are cut out of things that are really very important for them and have been very important for them in life, especially items of culture. Cultural organizations become very, very prominent. If it's their own theatre, if it's their own music, here you can see sort of pieces of theatre. You can see the choir, which again sort of a combination of this of German culture, but obviously you see the flag there. There's an aspirational identity there as well. And the orchestras that you can see, this is not the size of concert hall that an orchestra like that should be playing in. This is sort of you're using one of the shul classrooms type of thing for something that really belongs in the Royal Albert Hall. But they said this is important for us, and it might be that our access to culture and music is going to be in a different route, but nevertheless, we're going to hold on to things that are important for us. And sports, again, just another few examples. And I think that this, again, is a great example. And when one of my teachers sort of presented this picture, he said that not only has it got the sign that says that this bench isn't for Jews, is that also his working assumption, which is that German Jews were such rule followers and such sort of sticklers that there would have been no, as we say in Aramaic, havamina. There would have been no sense in the first place that you would sort of like sit on the bench which wasn't intended for you. But the question, like what it does to a society when this is what's on display, again, together with the signs that are on shops and the soldiers that are positioned outside Jewish stores, all of these things create sort of this hostile environment. And if we sort of just come towards really the night that we're talking about, this idea of the humiliation, and unfortunately, it's something that is really part of a pattern that we are familiar with today. And I think that you can't look at these pictures again taken by our enemies, taken by those people who hate us, and you can't divorce them from what we know our enemies insist on doing today. And that is capturing the horrific things they do on cameras. And again, today they're not done in black and white still photographs. They're done in video and a GoPro, and it's live streamed on Instagram or TikTok to people's loved ones. But the idea of a photograph like this, the same person who took the photograph like this, just like someone taking a photograph in 2023, knows that the intention is to instill fear. It's not about the 4 people who have to scrub the streets. It's about the thousands of people who are going to follow this this image around Germany, around the world, whoever it is that's going to see it. And I think that there's something I often feel like uncomfortable with photographs like these, because you're not looking at a construct, you're not looking at a moment, you're looking almost into the like heart and soul of someone who is in the process of losing everything, not just losing their dignity as this Jewish woman has to scrub the road, but all of the identity which she had, which for however long she'd felt at home in her sort of in her other homeland, in her Germany, all of a sudden is being taken away from her in public. And I'm just mindful of the time. But if we're going to to deal with this evening with the November pogrom, there's just a couple of photos here to finish with, really. And this is November 10th, Baden-Baden. And what you see outside is this is the entrance to the main synagogue. And although the photographs that we're used to seeing when it comes to this evening is the burning synagogues, there's something really sort of very distinct here, which is this is the community. This is the people of the town waiting on the steps of the steps of the synagogue. And a moment or two later, what you see is that in between this sort of these two crowds is a space for people to be walking in. The people who are outside and not going into the synagogue, they are the German civilians, German citizens. And what you see is this sort of parade of Jews walking into the shul. And this is the scene that's taken inside the shul. And it's odd for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think the first most striking thing are the bare heads. A synagogue of whichever denomination is not going to have all of these gentlemen with no hat, with no kippah, no head covering on. Number two is the stationing of these swastikaed German soldiers, Nazi soldiers, dotted around the synagogue. And the accounts of what's taking place really is that the Jewish community are brought in. They're told to remove their hats in sort of a sign, again, of humiliation that we're familiar with. And the reading that's happening from the front over here isn't a sermon. There are no jokes. It's not a Torah reading. It's a reading of excerpts of Mein Kampf, which is this is the precursor to sort of, I would say, the main event of the 10th of November 1938 for Baden-Baden, which is the same synagogue going up in flames. So I think that this sort of really brings us back to the original question that we asked right at the beginning, like how to speak of the night. Which is the image that sort of sticks with us? Is it the shul going up in flames and the glass being broken, which is obviously a physical tragedy and a community tragedy, and it has its like all of the tragedy built in there? Or is it something much more fundamental, which is happening to the community, to the Jews themselves? And I think that this moment, for me, captures a much greater depth of the tragedy here, which is because this humiliation, as we see, sort of once we know the larger story, is a precursor to once you humiliate people and move them out of a society, then the tens of thousands, 10,000 who are being carted off to concentration camps, and the thousands who are going to be murdered in the streets, it really lays the groundwork for that. And then we see that this becomes sort of the night, I would say, where everything changes for the Jewish community. So that's sort of my thoughts and a little overview here. And I would say just touching on what Rabbi Wannenberg, what you said right at the beginning, which is really to combine these two aspects, which is the things that were done to us and the responses. So with all of the destruction, the questions to sort of keep bearing in mind is like, how did people respond? And one of the things I like to say, and I'll close with this, which is when we talk about the tragedy of the Shoah, and we talk about the people who were murdered, there's one thing that every Jew who was murdered during the Shoah insisted on doing until the point that they were murdered, which was living. And be that those who were murdered in 1938 and be those who were murdered in 1945, the idea of defining the entirety of their life by their death would be the biggest mistake. In the same way as going to a Shiva house and asking the person sitting Shiva only questions about the disease or the end of a person would be not only sensitive, although we know people do it, insensitive,
Yeah.
yeah, it would be a mistake. So too, to define each and every victim of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, simply by the virtue of the fact that they were murdered al Kiddush Hashem, that they were murdered for the crime of being Jewish in the wrong place at the wrong time. I think we also have to talk about their Kiddush HaChaim, which is the way that they sanctified life in their own particular ways for every moment that was not the moment they were being murdered. So those are a few thoughts.
Thank you. Rabbi Sachs used to say one of our mistakes is we learn about how the Romans lived and the Greeks lived and how the Jews died. And I'm sure you would relate to that as an educator. One thing that strikes me is in Judaism generally, I mean, we mark the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem. The beginnings of things are often seen as, because it's the beginning of a tragedy, and Kristallnacht very much is the beginning of the end in many ways. It does surprise me that perhaps it's not given more prominence. We do obviously have to now sort of relate to what's going on today. It's interesting to speak to you as someone who obviously made your own decision to go live in Israel, but at the same time is spending a lot of time in Europe and obviously well aware of trends and communities in Europe, particularly in the UK. We were saying earlier, it's a terrible mistake to say we're back in 1939 or 1938, we should say, in Britain, in Europe. We're not. That's clearly the case. On the other hand, there are some very frightening trends that we've seen. And the fact that Britain's second city feels it's quite okay to say basically the Jews would not be safe if they came to that city to watch a football match, and then dresses it up by saying, well, because of the way the fans behaved in Amsterdam, anyone who knows a little bit about that knows that was essentially a pogrom, a modern-day pogrom. We've had people on the streets invoking the Battle of Cable Street, and then saying, down with fascists and right-wing extremists and down with Zionists as well, which is code for Jews. All these things, obviously, I guess, what are your thoughts on the present day? How do we find the balance between being concerned and expressing that concern, not making the same mistakes, not mistakes, but society shouldn't sleepwalk into a similar event, but not over exaggerating and not doing a disservice to the Shoah as a unique event in Jewish history. And I'm sure you know about Godwin's law, that the longer a discussion goes on online, the more likely there'll be someone will invoke the Nazis and the Holocaust. And I see it time and again, or often when people are throwing insults at each other, and it cheapens the Shoah because it's not 1938, but these are very frightening times in Europe, and particularly in Britain. I'd welcome your thoughts on that.
So I think sometimes our mistake is to give the Holocaust this uniqueness. Professor Yehuda Bauer, one of the sort of preeminent historians, he used to talk about uniqueness. He talks about unprecedented, because uniqueness gives this sense that it was once and it could never be again, and
Right.
therefore, in a sense, from a historic point of view, it doesn't really give you anything to learn. And I think also in terms of Holocaust education, there's a couple of things. Number one, I wouldn't call myself Holocaust educator. I would call myself involved in Jewish education. And the Holocaust is a chapter of that. I think when the Holocaust education is the thing in and of itself, then I think number one, sort of it consumes everything, and I don't think it stands alone. I think when we're thinking about anti-Semitism, sometimes we also make the mistake that we as Jews, that our job is to teach the world not to be anti-Semitic, when I think that our efforts would be much better used on teaching the Jewish world to be Jewish. And a little bit like you probably remember from Fiddler on the Roof, that when he says sort of let the world break its own head. Yeah, that sometimes our responsibility, again, we have a self-interest in there being less anti-Semitism, because it comes to a point that it doesn't do us so well. And I think that one of the shifts in the last 75 years is this idea that Jews, we used to appeal to people, asking them nicely not to be anti-Semitic. If you ask people where I live, our response to people being anti-Semitic is to sort of stand up and to have an army and to protect ourselves. And I think that in many ways the British Jewish community does that as well, saying we are going to protect ourselves. But the idea is sort of like going cap in hand to the world. And again, I'm not always so keen about talking about the world, hoping that if only we were to show the world how bad anti-Semitism is, then hopefully they'll get the memo and they'll stop. So I think that sometimes that is one mistake. Another mistake I think sometimes that we make is that when anti-Semitism is talked about as the Holocaust, and the Holocaust is talked about as anti-Semitism, then the bar of not being anti-Semitic is really quite low, because all the while that I'm not genociding 6 million Jews, men, women, and children, then I can probably consider myself like doing quite well. Whereas actually we should probably be saying that those people who sort of tell libelous stories about Jews, or make accusations about Jews, or someone who goes into a synagogue and kills 2 Jews, that's also, I would say, should be within our realm of like unacceptable anti-Semitic behavior. So I think we have to possibly be better at calling things out, not just in relationship or comparison to the Holocaust. So that's, I would say, like one piece. And I think that for me, encountering the Holocaust and Poland in particular, that we as J-Roots do many journeys each year, it's about telling the Jewish story. And I think that there's a sort of a model that we use, which is like the trauma and the toolbox, which is that we as Jews have this toolbox of how to survive things, partly because we've seen it. Our grandparents have seen it, our great grandparents have seen it, generations back. We've seen moments of trauma, and therefore we've been prepared of how to deal with them. And I think that if you want to sort of bring this model to look where we are today, the 7th of October, in particular, many of those like moments of like great Jewish heroism, which I think probably some of them on like really on biblical levels, some of the things that people did on that day in terms of their desire to fight and their desire to protect other people and to sacrifice themselves for other people, those didn't come from nowhere. And the sort of the spiritual toolbox and the practical toolbox that many of the hostages, their stories have come back with, they didn't come from nowhere. They weren't sort of sitting in the tunnels of Gaza, sort of with no input as sort of in. Although they were often in solitary confinement, from a historical and an identity point of view, they were never alone. They were carrying like threads and stories and ideas of how you survive these types of things from generations and generations of these stories which have been told, and the stories in a sense have served to inoculate us. And I think that if you look how we've used that toolbox is to take on our Jewishness and wear it like to double down. The phenomena, if you walk the streets of Israel, sort of people's identity, people's Israeli identity, people's Jewish identity has been, I would say, in the vast majority of cases, strengthened by the events of the last 2 years rather than weakened. Like very few people are responding to October the 7th to say, well, if only we sort of like turned off our Judaism and were a bit more sort of low key and didn't insist on being sort of unique, then everything would be okay. I think there's a clear sense that there is something unique about us. We have a story, we're part of a story, and the more that we can express that to ourselves, to our communities, to our families, to our children, then I think that is possibly one of our like biggest responses, because I think that we run the danger wherever we are in the world, but sort of also in a big part of my job dealing with young people from the UK in schools, all sorts of environments, that if the defining thing is that we are Jewish and we are attacked for being Jewish, I don't think it's not such an encouraging sell in terms of what you would want to be a part of. But if our communities and our schools are making the argument of like what Judaism is in a in standing on its own 2 feet, then I think that we have a much better chance of getting through this chapter as well.
You and I have discussed. You spoke in our show at the beginning of the war in Israel. I've repeated many times about when they were looking for a name for the war. Obviously, Simchat Torah, we start saying Mashiv HaRuach for the wind. So somebody suggested the Mashiv HaRuach war because they didn't want to call it the Simchat Torah war. And perhaps unintentionally, there's a very great double meaning there, because Mashiv HaRuach, I mean Meshiv HaRuach, which means to return the spirit to the Jewish people. I think that's almost quite unprecedented, actually. I mean, we talk about the show, and many people lost or said that they lost their faith afterwards. Here we have a recent tragedy which has galvanized people in an unbelievable way. And the same is true. There are certainly people who have, I hear from people in the UK who are afraid, more afraid to sort of show their Jewish identity. But there's so many people who have come out of the woodwork, particularly in workplaces, and who have stood up. I was also struck by something you said, which I hadn't thought about until now, about, we shouldn't be surprised that some of the worst examples of anti-Semitism we see today are taking place on sort of top university campuses, because that was the German experience as well. Being educated was never, didn't insulate you from being bigoted, clearly.
Yeah, and I think also the sometimes even like the smarter you are, the more developed your thought process is, and very few people, and I think this is also something that you need to be careful of, that very few people define themselves as hating people. Yeah, no one says I hate lots of people, or I particularly hate this group of people. No, and also we're used to this idea of sinat chinam, which is like baseless hatred. No one says that they hate anyone baselessly. Everyone always turns around and says, I don't hate people. I do hate this group of people, but only for this reason. And I think that sort of into sort of the less complex your thought is, well, this reason can be the size of his nose, or the sort of the influence he has on the media, and the more developed your thought process is, you say, no, I don't hate this person for any sort of genetic features. I hate them for their colonialism, or for the way that they sort of fit into a particular movement within the world, and that becomes something which is sort of academically justified.
Yeah, so implied they bring it upon themselves and all the rest of it. Yeah. So as an educator, I mean, this will have been a question, I suppose, the past 2 years, and since Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader in 2019, what would your message be, or has been, to your students that you're taking around Poland, you're taking to places of great devastation? They're coming from Britain, where we've seen a resurgence of some very insidious messaging, and I'm sure many of them are afraid, and I'm sure you have conversations about Jewish identity, particularly those perhaps who are going to university or starting out on their adulthood. What I mean, there's this very strong message here, obviously, of a stronger Jewish identity, but any specific thoughts on that? And I suppose also the question in everyone's mind. 2 people have said to me in the past week, who I would consider very British and very Anglo and very rooted in British society, they don't see a future for Jews in this country in 50 years' time. Obviously, you made Aliyah, so you would have a view on making Aliyah, but in terms of, Britain as we know it, and as the Britain that our grandparents fought for, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Is that an exaggeration from where you're standing, or is that, I've never heard that before in my life so much as I'm hearing it now from people who I would consider very established?
So I don't have the knowledge or the inside knowledge to sort of really cast sort of have a solid opinion on what the future of Anglo Jewry is. I would say that as Jews have always assumed that their family will probably not be in the same place in 100 years' time as they are now.
Yeah.
And the way that I remember Rabbi Sachs saying when he talked about LSJS replacing Jews College, he said the way that we build our communal infrastructure and institutions now in a world which has a state of Israel is different to a world that didn't have a state of Israel. And it might have been that 200 years ago, our family assumed that they were going to be moving from Kovno to Warsaw, and that could be one of our moves. But I think that anyone invested in sort of really seeing the moves of the Jewish world in the big sense, and I don't sort of speak to the sort of the individual sort of aliyah journey of any particular person, or even sort of the immediate change within any community, but I'm saying from a faithful Jewish point of view, the idea that the Jewish future lives in the land of Israel is a sort of a tenet of our belief. If you open to the end of what's it called, even in the Singer's Prayer Book, sort of after Shachar, and we know that Jewish movements that did away with the idea of the centrality of the land of Israel, even from a theoretical point of view, from a religious philosophical point of view, they lost a fundamental tenet. So I'm not so. Again, I've put my sort of cards on the table, but I'm not so scared of saying that, yes, the future of the Jewish people is not going to be in the long-term future of the Jewish people is not going to be in New York or London or Paris or any of these places. That's not to say that Jewish communities that are thriving and doing good things in these places are going to sort of disappear overnight either. I do think that wherever someone chooses to be, that their Jewishness should be sort of bigger and prouder, and that one of the responsibilities of the Jewish community, and this is probably like the higher echelons, is to protect Jews wherever they are, so that those questions aren't the questions which are being asked, which is, can I walk in the street with the kippah? Can I sort of send my daughter out with a Magen David on her necklace? And I think that we owe it to especially to our young people, but to the community as a whole, to ensure that they feel they can do that, because I think that type of owning of their Jewish identity is going to be the thing. Like, and I'll just close with this. I happened to be a basketball game in Katowice, Poland during the summer, and I personally was a little bit had my own questions, which is, do I walk into a stadium of 70,000 Poles and they were playing Slovenia, Poles and Slovenians, as the only Jew in the stadium wearing a kippah? And I had my own sort of question about whether or not this was what to do, and very happened to bump into a woman in Starbucks just before, who was wearing a Magen David, sort of almost as big as your face, and I had to ask her sort of what's the story? Jewish, you never know in Poland what stories. Turns out she was a Russian Jew who was now living in Berlin and was in Poland for work. So I had to ask the question. I said, everyone always asks me as a kippah wearer, so isn't it scary? Don't you worry about and don't you worry about the anti-Semitism? So I said, you walking around with a giant Magen David around your neck, doesn't it sort of provoke what's it called? Now, we're on a call with with a Zoom with very respectable people, so I won't use the actual words that she used. She said, well, if someone has a problem with this, then they. And then you can finish the sentence yourself. She had zero regard and zero time for the person who was going to be challenging her about her choice to wear her Jewishness on her sort of around her neck. And it was as if I'd been sent this sort of like momentary meeting with her to say to me, like, don't be worrying about 70,000 Poles and Slovenians inside the stadium. If you wear your kippah, then you'll be fine. And I think, like, sort of, I come back to something that I pull out in Poland all the time, which is, again, back to Rabbi Sachs. He says non-Jews respect Jews who respect their Judaism.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that, although unfortunately we've seen over the last couple of years that it's not always true. And the sort of the goodwill that we hope to see amongst people is not always there. I think we need to create a space for our community that does feel safe, so that we can wear our Judaism with pride. And I think that's going to be the answer.
And on a slightly lighter note, also, when you wear a kippah, you get all kinds of interesting experiences with people that, if you're not obviously Jewish, you don't have the same experiences. The last on the chat Phil Kaplan, I'm sure you know him, sometimes think we might be living in 1912, not realizing what lies in the future. I think Zach touched on that with the observation that we've always been a transitional community. It amuses me that so many Jews are in property. It makes no sense at all, really, because actually we've always, I think perhaps the difference is that perhaps in Britain, we've all become very comfortable, very British, and Chief Rabbi's always been in the House of Lords. We have good contacts in government. The Prime Minister at the time came to the October 7th commemoration. We're part of the establishment. Nothing would ever happen to us. I'm sure the German Jews felt the same way. And perhaps we do need to remember that we are, according to Jewish tradition, we are guests in a foreign land, even when we think we've put our roots down. One thing I do find fascinating is those who are fearful talk about making Aliyah. Now, of course, in practical terms, Israel is the most dangerous country in the last 2 years for a Jew to live in, and yet that doesn't stop people going there. So there's clearly something else at play. It's not just natural fears, because then we would all go to sort of Singapore, but we're going to Israel. We're still going to Israel. That's does strike me, but I think there's something very sobering about that. We're marking Kristallnacht, and I agree with everything you're saying about Jewish identity. At the same time, sometimes, unfortunately, anti-Semitism really does, it's very close to home for many of us. I look at my own experience as somebody, and my older boys are on the tube every day with their kippot. We've not had a single problem. My son came back last night from bar mitzvah 11 o'clock on the tube, no issues. So my lived experience is a positive one. Others don't have the same experience, and I'm not belittling that. And certainly think anyone not seeing the protests on campus or the protests in central London, it's very worrying. Anyone that reads Melanie Phillips, I have a lot of respect for, would think that we should all shut the lights and get out of the country. I don't think that is the sentiment entirely, but I certainly think people are feeling perhaps more fragile than they have before. But perhaps that also feeds into our Jewish identity, as you said, reminds us that this is not really our home as much as we might think it is, and however British we think we are. I started off with Dov earlier by saying that we leave the lights on for Kristallnacht, and it struck me that I'm assuming we do that as a sort of perhaps an act of defiance, to say we're still here and we're not going anywhere, but also that there's a motif of light, and you talked about it a lot in your educational work. I mean, you said it very nicely. That it's not a good look when the only message to our young people is, don't do Hitler's work for him. You have to marry Jewish, you have to be Jewish, because so many of us died for our Judaism. That's it's a very negative identity, and it's certainly not something that's a great sell, is it? And I like the idea of transforming that, turning it around, even when you're taking groups around the camps, and being able to turn it into a positive. And that's something that seems to be at the heart of what you do, which I think is fantastic. It's a much more encouraging vision for the future. I don't know if anyone else has any questions. Everyone's very quiet. Oh, no.
I'll say one thing,
Yeah.
which is a little the idea of synagogues, shuls all over the world sort of leaving their lights on. I'm going to sort of compare it. I think it was the Rebbe who said when they were fighting for Russian Jewry, and they said people were campaigning to leave an empty chair at the table for the Russian Jews. He said better that you actually invite somebody.
Absolutely.
So I think that there's something almost comical about the idea that sort of we're so upset about all of these shuls that were destroyed, so we're going to leave our shuls empty and leave the lights on as a protest. So maybe next year we can launch and a special November pogrom or Kristallnacht davening of Ma'ariv in a shul, and you can also have the lights on at the same time. We can sort of kill two birds with one stone.
100%. I agree with you. Absolutely. There is a lot of these things can easily feel like virtue signaling. No, I definitely would agree with that. I think we want more Jews doing more Jewish things more of the time at the Stratland United Synagogue these days. It's very late for you. I'm very conscious. I don't know if anyone else has any questions. I can't really see anyone, so just give people a minute or two if you want to post anything. But otherwise, I want to say a big thank you to you, Zach, first of all, for staying up late for us and at short notice. Definitely a lot of food for thought. Edgy, I want to say. Not just towing the party line that we've heard many times. I'm very struck by what you said about on the one hand, the need to obviously honor the show, and on the other hand, the need not to use that to, as you said, as long as they don't kill 6 million of us, it's not so bad. And as you said, I mean, Manchester really struck terror in the hearts of many people for obvious reasons. Your hometown, obviously, it was I don't say a wake up call, but it's something that really hit us very hard. And One of the very sad things I think about being Jewish in 2025 is you'll see a report of an attack and you'll see only one person was killed. You'll think, oh, that wasn't so bad, rather than thinking a person was killed. I think everyone's probably just taking in a lot of what you shared. Any closing thoughts for us, I guess?
I think we covered, but I really think that again, my only of communities in England. Well, first of all, you did say that in Birmingham you would describe as the second city. So as a Mancunian, I'll take issue with
Right.
that. But in terms of in terms of communities, and I say this with sort of Sally and Philip here, sort of across the road, and also Michael Rainsbury just across the road. Community's greatest, like one of community's greatest strengths is also not to see in the same way that I think not seeing that there's holiness in buildings, but there's a much more holiness in people. And I think that the investment in people rather than investment in buildings is also a Jewish awareness. And it's an awareness that communities wax and wane, and that the Jewish world sort of shifts and moves, and the movement of Jews from place to place, especially when it's done out of like ratzon, out of desire, rather than out of being pushed, is really just a natural development of the Jewish people. And I think that a community which has raised all these people, Miri and Michael and many of the people who have gone on to different places, and many of them who've come to Israel, and there's Tobias is around the corner. There's many people sort of that Wanson Woodford has like developed and put out into the wider community, because it's not just about one place, it's about the Jewish people as a whole. And I think that if we're on a night like tonight, if we're mourning the death of Jews and of Jewish communities at the hands of sort of our enemies, then our response is to build Jewish communities, to build communities wherever they may be. And in the same way that you don't just sort of hold on to the people in one place because this is where they were, you send them out to go and to develop and to build. And I think that's really the credit to the community, to Wanson Woodford, Woodford Forest as a whole, the things it's managed to do.
Phil just posted, of course, that the destruction of the temple is not the destruction of Judaism. Even we have the Mikdash Ma'at, of course. I'll name check the person who told me at Andrew Wolfe in Cardiff, said to me many years ago that when they knocked the shul down to build a new shul 100 yards up the road because they downsized, he initially was very upset because he always said he was going to sit in his father's seat, and now his father's seat's been destroyed. Where am I going to sit? He said, but then I realized my father's seat is wherever I sit. I think that just encapsulates, no point having empty buildings. It's very much about, we talk about that in relation to our shul merge as well. Zach, thank you so much. We miss you.
Well, my pleasure.
If you're ever passing through on your way to Europe, do stop in.
All right, thank you very much.
And thank you so much for your time. Thank you everyone that's joined us. A lot of food for thought. I wasn't sure where this was going to go, but I'm really pleased that we've talked a lot about positive Jewish life and not just kind of memorializing, because I just think that is so important, and the work you do and Jay does is so important for that as well. So thank you very much, and thank you to Dog.
More than a pleasure.
Thank you everyone for joining us. And we will leave it. We have got the lights on. There you go. And we will leave them on because that's what people do. But you're right. There's a lot more to it than that. Yeah. In fact, I have posted in previous years that not only when we light the candles, the yellow candles, so not just lighting a yellow candle, but the biggest thing we can do is to raise our children with these traditions and with this heritage that they try to destroy. So I think that absolutely encapsulates it, and we will keep doing that, all of us, I'm sure. So thank you very much. Stay safe. Wish you well, and we should meet on happy occasions always.
Amen.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Joined us, and wish you a good evening.